So what we're going to do today is we're going to concentrate in this 45 minutes on that bit. What needs to be done to change Britain's economy? How far do we need to change it? What might we make that happen? And to discuss that, I've got my all-star panel, whose various biographies are so long they cover about a page and a half between them. So I'll just limit them. I'll cut them down. So, Ha-Joon Chang, reading Political Economy of Development at the University of Cambridge. And I'll just mention one of your books, Ha-Joon, 23 Things That They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, which was published a couple of years ago. In the middle, we've got Karel Williams, who's Professor of Accounting and Political Economy at Manchester Business School, but who's also Director of the Centre for Research on Social Cultural Change, and who's co-author of After the Great Complacence, which was published by OUP last year. And finally, Mariana Mazzucato, who's Professor of Economics at the University of Sussex, but whose publication I'd most like to mention for her is actually on the entrepreneurial state, which was published by Demos last year. And so what we're aiming to do is to have a chat between us, covering some of these issues. We may have time for questions, we may not, depending on how the panelists are feeling, whether they're flagging or not. The first question to each of you, really, is if you were to arrive in Britain for the first time around now and put on Newsnight or Radio 4, you think the entire economic debate in Britain revolved around too far, too fast, or we need to make more spending cuts. To what extent do you think that sums up the economic problems in Britain? Karel, can I start with you?
I think that's very much a metropolitan view of where we're at. It's a media view of where we're at. If you're actually living in Manchester or Huddersfield, questions of manufacturing, broken supply chains, the fact that you take, for example, a big regional issue in the Northwest was the jobs that were saved at the Vauxhall Astra factory. We also know that that car is effectively 90% imported content. There isn't a set of supply chains around the factory. Now, those issues, I think, are alive at a regional level, but not making the national news.
Okay. Ha-Joon, you've written a fair amount about the austerity debate for my newspaper. Can you hear? Yeah? How's that?
No.
Okay. Okay. Okay, we're meant to be mic'd up. So if you don't hear, just wave at me, okay? Ha-Joon, you've written quite a lot for my newspaper on the austerity debate. How far do you think this debate about spending cuts versus fewer spending cuts and slower spending cuts sums up what's wrong?
Yeah, well, I think what Britain needs to realize is that the issue is not just about this short-term spending. I mean, of course, there's a bigger agenda behind this, basically destroying the welfare state. So that debate is there, but I would very much like to build upon what Karel said about the state of British manufacturing. You know, Peter Mandelson, like the PR genius he is, once dug up this gem of a fact that the British economy still is the 6th largest manufacturing economy in the world. But this is mainly on account of Britain having a lot of people. On per capita basis, it's about the 20th in the world. Yeah? Lower than Luxembourg, which you thought that probably didn't have a single factory. Lower than Iceland, for God's sake. Yeah? So, you know, Larry Elliott and Dan Atkinson recently published his book called Going South, which says that Britain's in danger of becoming a third world economy. And I think they are slightly exaggerating, but only very slightly. I mean, you are really getting there. And I'm beginning to get really worried because based on the things like what Karel said, I'm beginning to think that probably this country's manufacturing cannot be recovered. I mean, you have lost that critical mass. I mean, I'm not sure, but you might have actually fallen behind that critical threshold. And unless you come up with what development economists in the 1950s used to call the big push, you are not going to rebuild the manufacturing industry. I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't done any solid empirical research, but the kind of bits of research I get to see, makes me think that. And basically we are talking about a very long-term problem which won't be addressed unless you are doing the equivalent of, I don't know, what Japan did in the 1950s or South Korea did in the 1960s, major industrial development plan. Without addressing that, yes, I mean, restrain bankers pay here a bit and I mean, that lend a bit more to small businesses, we are not going to rebuild the economy. So I think the first step towards this reform is to realize how serious the situation is.
Mariana, do you share this pessimism?
Yes, but the quote that you said, too fast, too much, I mean, I think it's really problematic that that's been Labour's line. They don't have, in lots of the slogans that they've been putting out, they haven't been communicating sort of a different theory of where growth comes from. And coming back to Dean Baker's talk, which I thought was excellent, his point that, what actually drives business investment? It's not just kind of tweaks in interest rates or tax rates. So, an enterprise zone, which is focused mainly on basically reducing different types of tax or costs for companies, basically attracts the most mediocre companies, which aren't viable, will be viable during these 5 years of the enterprise zone, and then go bust, and they probably should have gone bust from the beginning. And so what we need is, to understand, and this also comes to the question that one of the last questions in the last session asked, which I don't think Dean actually answered, which is what is the role of public investment sort of in new industries, technology, and research? And I think that what drives business investment, and this is what we absolutely need to be talking about now, how to get that going, are sort of new technological and market opportunities. And the demand part that Dean talked about is about the market, yeah? But there's also, the reason that Pfizer left Sandwich, Kent, and went to Boston is not because Boston is cheaper, not because it has less red tape and less taxes, but because it is one of the states in the US that has benefited the most from the NIH, National Institute of Health spending, which pharmaceutical companies all over the world have depended on. And this also comes to a problem with labor, which I think is really important to talk about, that we have to stop mythologizing certain actors. So it's not that, for example, VC created the biotech revolution in the States. VC came in something like 15 years after major amounts of state spending on biotech. And yet labor in 2002, and I'm sorry, I'm just attacking labor, but the point is, obviously we all here in this room disagree with Osborne and with Cameron. But the point is, how, what are the underlying assumptions which many of us have bought into? And again, VC, I think, is a perfect example. So labor in 2002 reduced the time that private equity has to be held in order to be eligible for capital gains tax reductions from 10 years to 2 years. Because, why? Because we need more VC. We want to make them richer because they're going to invest. First of all, they didn't increase VC investment. In fact, it reduced it. But the point is that, the idea that somehow you reduce capital gains tax reductions and that's going to increase investment has no empirical basis. And VC has actually not been the motor of some of the periods of greatest growth. They only have achieved what they have achieved after massive amount of state spending. So you do not reduce state spending here and then just make it easier for, say, private equity and venture capital. We have a problem, and if you want, the system of innovation in this country, which we've mythologized some of the actors.
I'd add one point. I'm sure Mariana is right that we do need some sectors of the future, but we also need to be very careful that we defend mundane activities. And this, again, is a very important provincial point of view. Our largest manufacturing sector is food processing. The largest consumer of machinery in this country is food processing. Food processing employs 400,000 people. Now, in our concern with systems of innovation, we need to be sure also that we pay attention to the behavioral problems of the supermarkets beating up their suppliers and destroying their profit margins. Now, there are a whole series of very mundane things which are an important part of the point that Ha-Joon was making, which is we're coming back from a very low level. We don't have sector champions in high tech and all the rest of that. And of course we need to pay attention. But, South Manchester is not the next Silicon Glen or Silicon Fen. And it's the sausage factory that's the main thing that we need to hang on to. Also, incidentally, fairly high union density and awful industrial relations because of the churning of orders by the supermarkets.
Okay, but if you were to say to someone that the reason Britain's in this mess that's dated back to 2007, 2008 is because of poor management of sausage factories, they'd look at you and say, what are you talking about? Just join up the crisis that we're in now with the kind of points that you're making, Karel.
The crisis that we're in now, well, the crisis is multidimensional. There's a crisis in the sausage factory, surely, but there's also a broader crisis, which both Mariana and Ha-Joon were talking about having simply a disastrously wrong mix of fiscal and monetary policy. Now, and I think we need, again, to push out the boat fairly radically there, because the problem with monetary policy is we have an ultra-loose monetary policy, zero interest rates, quantitative easing, which is a kind of bank welfare system designed to keep the finance sector going while we look around us and everybody else is being punished. There's something wrong here somewhere, and that's a political problem, not a technical problem.
Yeah. I think the ultimate example of that problem is, you know, I mean, I'm all in favor of setting up a national investment bank, but I mean, you already have a bank that you can use to finance industry, Royal Bank of Scotland, which is 83% owned by the government. Yeah? And this government and even the opposition is not willing to say that since we own this bank, we are going to make it finance industrial development, which is what the French did, what the Koreans did, what the Chinese did to develop their industries in the 1960s and 70s. Yeah? But I mean, the dominance of the financial sector has become so strong that this government isn't even willing to follow the capitalist principle of the dominant shareholder calling the shots. Yeah? What is this? I mean, it's not even capitalism. Yeah? So I think that kind of deeper problem needs to be addressed.
But
yes.
Ha-Joon, just to come back to you, if you're saying that our manufacturing base is per head smaller than Iceland's, then you are actually, in your pessimism, confirming the view of many people in government who would say, actually, manufacturing in this country is too far gone, and that to go around chasing after more manufacturing is, you know, a loser's game. What do you say to that?
Oh, no, but you know, you have to think positively. Huh? You know, back in 1961, South Korea had a per capita income of $82, yeah? Less than half that of Ghana's. Yeah? Its manufacturing, the output was something like $20 per capita. You know, it built a world-class manufacturing base from that. So I'm not saying that it's irrecoverable. I'm saying that it cannot be recovered without a major push, major plan, you know, coordinated policy. So I mean, you shouldn't necessarily go down the route and say, you know, I mean, frankly, your financial sectors are broken as well. So where are you going to get the money to feed yourselves? Eh? No, I mean, the situation is really serious. I mean, this country had practically 30% devaluation in the last 3 years. Yeah? Any country would have had a major export boom with that kind of devaluation. Yeah? Your trading position is slightly worsening even after 30% devaluation. Yeah? So that's the kind of serious state you are in. And unfortunately, the political leaders in this country do not recognize it.
But I mean, I think there's a problem by saying that you know, it's a question of rebalancing the economy, say, away from finance towards manufacturing, and then the obvious question is which parts of manufacturing. In the study that we just did for a big European Commission funded project, we found that there was all sorts of examples where, you know, the key issue is the effect that finance has had, let's call it financialization, even though it's a bit of a fuzzy term, on all sorts of sectors in manufacturing. So different industries in manufacturers, from computing to pharma to biotech, even to nanotech, and some of the more traditional sausage type, you know, fish and chip type places. And it's not, you know, it's some of the obvious stuff so that we don't have the types of, you know, if you want counter-cyclical lending that countries that do have investment banks, we don't have that. But also that the way, for example, that UK banks operate have often been penalizing some of the firms that actually want to be engaging with, the stuff that we want. So, for example, we found that the most innovative firms have been hit the worst during the credit crisis, during the credit crunch, but also in the 5 years leading up to it. There was all sorts of evidence that, the risk, if you want, that comes with actually engaging with Schumpeterian innovation was actually being penalized, whereas those companies that were actually speculating and, for example, just focusing on their stock price were being rewarded. And by the way, this country is the one that is most copying the US in terms of some of this behavior. So, for example, the stock buyback craze, which we saw increasing, especially in the 10 years before the crisis hit, we found at the company level and at the industry level that stock buybacks are definitely inversely related to, say, human capital formation and R&D spending. And this is really important because people talk about skills as if they somehow just fall down from the sky, but skills are also endogenously created. So the question is, how do you actually reform the system so that those companies that do invest in skill formation and different types of human capital and R&D are rewarded instead of penalized? And that's a question about understanding, again, the role that financialization has had and permeated throughout all sorts of different industries. And until we repair that, there's, it's not going to be enough to just reduce finance in terms of size. It's its influence.
But Karel, didn't we just have 13 years of Labour government that thought that it was really concentrating on human capital, that it wanted more and more people to go to university and come out with degrees and compete against new engineers from India and China and all the rest of that?
Well, that would be wonderful if we didn't all drive German cars and if we didn't all use Chinese smartphones, is the short answer. This is a country with 100 billion a year trade deficit. 100 billion a year. Now, unless you actually increase exports or substitute imports, logically there are only two ways to do it. You are, in the medium term, I think, exposed to the judgment of the markets and the IMF. The trend, Ha-Joon made the point that we'd had a depreciation of the pound, which had really just about held exports on trend, rather than created an export boom. In this situation, you simply look at the curve of exports, the curve of imports. The trade deficit gets larger. Now, we are to some extent immunized because people treat the pound as an asset class, disconnected from the real economy and the trade balance. But that only works up to a point. The markets may at present, with a choice of European asset classes, be prepared to buy the pound, to hold the pound, with a 100 billion trade deficit. It's not sustainable with a 150 billion trade deficit. And I think everybody would agree there. And the central problem is the activities which New Labour backed either couldn't generate exports in any substantial volume or generated huge liabilities for the taxpayer, which was the case with finance.
I remember, Aditya, that you and I once had an argument about this because when Siemens won the UK procurement contract, my line was, yeah, well, of course. It's one of the greenest companies in the world from one of the countries that has actually been nurturing, innovation in all sorts of ways, both in terms of its, Landesbanks as well as the Fraunhofer Institutes and its spending on green, which is much higher here. And what did they win the procurement contract for? Build, fast, green, modern trains. And instead of, blaming, this is one case where was that what we should have been saying is the reason we haven't produced companies that can compete with Siemens is because we don't have the proper industrial policy. But it's not, don't give Siemens a procurement contract. Again, that's very controversial, but no one, I didn't hear anyone, if you want, from the left that was saying that, the problem is, again, why is the UK not producing, if you want, the modern goods that the world wants to buy? And why does Siemens do it? It's not from
I represent the left on Siemens versus Bombardier. The reason Siemens got the contract had nothing whatsoever to do with the greenness of the trains. It had to do with the fact that finance was bundled in. That it was not only a manufacturing contract, it was a 30-year maintenance contract which was tied in.
Where does
And Bombardier had an inferior credit rating to Siemens, which completely scuppered the bid. Now, that's a very interesting example because it raises fundamental questions about the competences of British civil servants in arranging contracts in the way that would be thought seemly in most other European countries, which is the French, broadly speaking, favor their own train manufacturers. Here we produced a bundled contract which had a bias against the British manufacturer regardless of the quality of the product. Fundamental questions, therefore, about the competence of the civil service, which we can remember was basically the institution which buggered the first attempt at modernization under Heath and Wilson. The question of why that one went wrong is a quite fundamental issue which we need to return to over the next few years.
Yeah. Okay, but before, rather than just carry on with Siemens versus Bombardier, let me, since you mentioned the word buggered, let me do the how buggered are we question. Ha-Joon, if things continue like they are, where will the UK economy be in 10 years?
Oh, I don't want to think about it. Sorry. No, I mean, you have to realize that there's a fundamental global shift in the production structure. You know, I don't know how it will exactly pan out, but you know, the chance is that if you don't get your acts together now, I mean, you will fall further behind. I mean, that Larry Elliott will be proven right. You know?
So we will become a third world country?
Well, at least in terms of the manufacturing industry, I mean, you are already behind many countries that have been considered developing, like Korea and Taiwan. And at this rate, yes, I mean, you soon will be in the grave danger of being relegated to the third division of world manufacturing. No, this is quite a remarkable achievement when you think about it, because this country used to be called the workshop of the world, and it was no joke. I mean, in the 1860s and 70s, it used to produce 20% of world manufacturing output, accounted for 47% of world manufacturing trade. You think everything's made in China? China still only accounts for less than 20% of world manufacturing trade. Yeah? So yes, the big achievement, but since you achieved that really big on the downside, maybe you can achieve it on the positive side now. Yeah?
Mariana, let's keep it simple. Give us one policy that you would adopt to prevent us becoming in the kind of third division of manufacturing.
One policy?
One policy. Because you're only going to get one each.
You can't ask it that way, come on.
You can't give me your entire pamphlet. One policy.
It would have to be, well, a set of policies, but if you want, to demythologize, again, what is actually driving an investment. So, I mean, the first thing is definitely increase capital gains tax. I'm sorry, but it's really problematic how low it is. It has only increased inequality. And at the same time, get, not just tax, but the right spending, if you want, in place that actually increases investment. But can I just come back to the question that you asked him? Because I think what's missed is what are our competitors doing? I mean, China is spending 1.5 trillion in these 7 new sectors, which are new generation, IT, new engines, environmentally friendly technologies. Brazil is spending huge amounts through their development bank. So this is the point. Because these areas actually are very path dependent. This is why Germany today is still the world's most important machine tool manufacturer. Being first actually matters. So by not actually entering the race, we spend more on furniture than on green in this country. We are out of the picture because green is the new internet in terms of returns. Okay, so Karel, Mariana's big policy is to keep private capital more invested in the enterprises which they own.
If you want one policy, and of course the answer is it's not amenable to one policy because you've got to line up several things. But if you want one policy, value-added promotion. concessions on corporation tax for firms which increase output organically.
Explain that. Explain it simply.
Essentially, we've had an infatuation with pro-enterprise generic policies, that if you offer people low personal tax, low corporation tax, everybody, including the financial sector and many other of the undeserving, somehow or other, jobs and prosperity will drop out. I think the interest of most of the people on the platform would be in a much more selective kind of regime, which actually targeted specific objectives. And the number one objective I would target is output increase, a non-financial thing, because output and employment are very closely related. But let me come back then to the question of why I think that's a priority, and as you put it, the Buggered question. It's not simply a question of becoming a third-rate manufacturing economy. The country is simply pulling politically apart. You will no longer be able to take the national for granted. Let me give you some examples of this. Output per head in Wales is 45% of output per head in London. And it's declining more or less every year. We're heading towards Sicilian levels, a kind of Mezzogiorno of the industrial north. And that's going to stress the politics and pull the country apart. There are a whole series of ways in which this is already happening. I think one of the most ominous developments is the way in which the London labour market is effectively importing immigrant labour from the EU, instead of, as in the 1930s, when London and the South East imported Welsh miners, Welsh school teachers, and people Geordies from the North East. The country will, if we carry on like this, we will cease to exist as a nation in the present political sense.
So we'll have some kind of Boris Johnson separatism where London and South East split off from the rest of the country. Well, that's the implication of what you're saying.
I mean, I think if you look at Europe, the very interesting thing is that the strident separatism is in the affluent regions. It's the north of Italy which sustains the Northern League. It's Flanders that sustains Flams Belang. The clapped-out Walloon, French-speaking ex-steel and coal areas are just at the receiving end of that kind of politics. Yes, and I think you're absolutely dead right. Boris Johnson is the kind of cheap populist who'd see that there's a lot of mileage to be had in criticising the undeserving Geordies.
The Southern League, yeah?
Ha-Joon, just one policy from you, and then I want to just wrap up.
Yeah, no, I think, there are so many things to do, but I think I would suggest that you have to start by actually taking stock and realizing where you are. I mean, I think that is sorely missing in this country. Once you convince people that there is a serious problem, then all sorts of solutions will come out. But until you realize how seriously you are in danger of falling off the cliff, no one will do anything. And unfortunately, politics is controlled by the financial sector, essentially. So, I mean, they are happy their wealth is going up, not down, and why should they care? But unless you kind of create a new national consensus that we need a new industrial revolution, you are not going to solve this problem.
Okay, so final question, and this will go to all of you, is how do you make that happen politically and otherwise? Where in civil society do you see the potential for a coalition that would push for that?
Well, ultimately it will have to come from democratic politics. So, I mean, it's not my job to do that. I mean, it's the politicians'
But where do you see the sources for optimism politically? Where do you see the Labour politician who's aware of all of this? Where do you see, the government departments have woken up to this?
I haven't met them yet.
I have.
Doesn't mean that they don't exist, but
Mariana thinks she has.
Well, no, I mean, I definitely think that Chukwumuna is, presents a very different vision from what? From the big poster. If you go to BIS, the Business Innovation Skills Department, I was just there because I spoke at the Heseltine Review a couple days ago, and I was shocked. I actually took a picture with my phone at the poster outside. It says, Britain is open to business. We have the lowest tax and the lowest regulation. I'm like, that's what like a third world, well, that's like the third world mentality, which is you attract business by, sort of giving them sort of free things. That is not what Germany does, and it's not what Silicon Valley does. And it was really sad. I'm like, my God. So I think that if you, read for sure, Chukwumuna has a wonderful speech he gave in Liverpool a couple months ago, and that definitely presents a very different vision of what, drives business investment. It's not just, again, low corporate tax and low regulation. It's in some ways the opposite. It's, a proper state which is not just doing the, public-private partnerships type stuff. Because I think the reason that Labour didn't get it right, and I think that's a good sort of symbol of where they got it wrong, is not just because the PPPs, whatever, were structured badly. It's because it didn't actually embody a real view of what the state's role is in this partnership. It's not just sort of mitigating the risk of the private sector. It's actually playing a serious role in terms of market making, market shaping, not just fixing little bits here and there with little bandages.
Okay, Karel, final word to you. How do you break from the rhetoric that you do here, which is the future of this country must inevitably lie in creating another Apple, having another James Dyson, having better functioning banks, and that's basically where it stops?
Yes, well, the short answer is that there is already a substantial surplus white working class population in this country. If you go to the northeast or Wales, 20% plus of the working age population are parked up on benefit. The Apple or the Dyson model does absolutely nothing for this problem, which will one way or another return to haunt us, because this isn't a technical matter of how you reform welfare. But if you actually come back to who's then up to the challenge, I'd have more faith in Chukwumuna if it weren't for Ed Balls. Essentially, I do not think that you can graft progressive industrial policy onto reactionary treasury policy. And I could give you an academic lecture on the 1960s, which makes that point very effectively. I also think we have absolutely fundamental problems about the competencies in the civil service. They are essentially, departments are kind of neoliberal think tanks, and they lack the sectoral knowledge and expertise for intervention. That's a massive kind of problem. Against that background, I think my general view is I am pessimistic that the Westminster and the Whitehall machine can in fact process the present problem without defaulting onto Boris Johnson populism. And I tend to think, therefore, that it's much more interesting to look at local and regional developments and ask questions like, what has your supermarket done recently for the local community except extract £100 per household per week? I think there are all kinds of very interesting, highly divergent ways of thinking which we will now be forced to consider.